Journalists are trying to turn a 57-player flop into a moral revolution against the evil, oppressive West. So let's see what the thought leaders of the journalistic caste have to say about Relooted. Oh. Oh no. Apparently this game left the poor Kotaku author feeling, and I quote, overwhelming rage. Now, forgive me, but feeling overwhelming rage while playing a, frankly, rather bad 2.5D platformer about dragging tables under shutters is ambitious, to say the least. Certainly not a sign of mental fortitude. And yes, the journal obviously liked the game. I suppose that's what people mean when they talk about a certain brand of urban liberals. The kind where something becomes brilliant the second it gives you an excuse to self-flagellate some more. Alright, enough joking. We have to move fast, this game is already dead as of yesterday, these celebration pieces have a shelf life measured in day, and if we don't dissect them now, they'll disappear quietly along with the last remaining players. The really embarrassing thing is that a lot of the journals are framing this as, and again I quote the title, a big black middle finger to history controlled by white people. Stunning, brave, and powerful headline, which is followed by an even more stunning and brave article. Shame it rests on a cartoon understanding of how restitution, provenance research, and museums actually work. Now, here's the interesting part. I didn't just learn about museums from Reddit and Twitter, I did my civil service at the Austrian Ministry of Culture, specifically in the department dealing with provenance research and restitution, the boring bureaucratic documentation-heavy grunt work, the part where you organize primary sources so researchers can actually prove things before state property worth millions moves across borders. So let's use this little media meltdown as an opportunity, not just to laugh, but to take a look at how restitution actually works, and why this is so rare in colonial contexts. Modern provenance research did not emerge from a decolonial seminar in 2018. It intensified across Europe because of the crimes of National Socialism. After 1945, and especially from the 1990s onward, when archives opened and pressure mounted, it became impossible to ignore that museums were holding objects that had been confiscated, forcibly sold, or otherwise transferred under coercion during the Nazi regime. Families had been dispossessed, parts of collections had been built on theft that required a certain correction. And if you want to correct something in a civilized society, you do not start stealing random stuff from museums, you do not empty your own cultural heritage because some random person feels wrong, you establish a legal framework, you examine what the current documentation provides, and you determine what entered a collection illegally by today's legal standards, and more importantly, who it specifically belonged to instead of returning something to a random group. Now this was not uniquely Austrian. Germany, the Netherlands, France, many other European countries professionalized provenance research for exactly that reason. But Austria had a very particular incentive to take this seriously and to professionalize far more rigorously, because our federal museums hold almost exclusively state property. The objects do not belong to the museum, they do not belong to some private foundation, they belong to the republic as a whole, they are part of the cultural heritage of all its citizens. That means if an object leaves the country, changes ownership, or is restituted, it is not a symbolic gesture for social media applause on Reddit. It is a legal act involving public assets, and if the object is valuable enough, the public will absolutely care. And that is precisely where this entire journal cheering for just steal it back loses the plot. Provenance research does two things simultaneously. It allows you to return objects when dispossession can be proven, and it protects the state when claims cannot actually be substantiated. Both matter equally. Provenance research will not always conclude that an object entered a collection unlawfully. Actually, it can quite regularly conclude the opposite. That result must be accepted just as much as the opposite outcome. For example, when a multi-million euro Klimt is restituted because the documentation clearly demonstrated it entered a collection under coercion. And here's the part that most of these Anglosphere journals completely ignore. American courts are not shy when it comes to asserting jurisdiction over foreign state assets in restitution-related cases. The legal framework in the US is in many instances structurally far more favorable to claimants, mostly Jews, than European administrative systems would ever be. That is a simple fact. Which means that, from time to time, when Austrian artworks are loaned to US institutions, they can very easily become entangled in litigation where sovereign immunity suddenly turns out to be far less absolute than many Europeans would assume. Claims are filed in an American court, Austrian state-owned objects suddenly become targets of proceedings, and even when the factual basis of a claim is ultimately disputed, weak, or virtually non-existent, the mere process can freeze, delay, or complicate the movement of publicly owned works. At times, due to how favorable the US system is, even a weak chain of ownership can suffice for an Austrian asset to be seized and then returned to some claimant, which was a major motivation for why we as a country so quickly invested into advancing our provenance research. From an Austrian perspective, that is not just some abstract morality tale, that is our cultural heritage being pulled into a foreign jurisdiction that does not necessarily apply the same evidentiary standards as our procedural logic. And no, Austrians are not particularly enthusiastic about the idea that artworks owned by the Republic can effectively be treated as leverage in overseas litigation. That does not mean that Holocaust restitution is unjustified, it very clearly is, and it enjoys broad support across the political spectrum here, but that does not mean that every claim automatically holds up under scrutiny, and that is something important to keep in mind for the entire idea of colonial restitution as well. Provenance research exists precisely to separate substantiated claims from unsubstantiated ones. If an object was confiscated or sold under the US, it should be restituted. If documentation shows that an object entered a collection lawfully long before the Nazi period, that also has to be acknowledged. In a rule of law state, you prove dispossession. You do not randomly assume it because it makes you feel good. Because once you abandon evidentiary discipline, you're no longer correcting injustice, you're just gambling with public property in an international legal arena that is anything but neutral. If a 50 million euro artwork were restituted on weak or poorly documented grounds, and the public later discovered that the basis for all of this was thin or virtually non-existent, the backlash would be far from subtle. It would not just damage the credibility of the institution, it would damage the credibility of the entire restitution framework. And that would ultimately hurt the very communities restitution mechanisms were originally designed to protect. This is precisely why Austria ended up developing one of the most structured provenance frameworks worldwide. Not because it was fashionable at the time, not because we're a uniquely woke country, but because when you're dealing with millions in state assets, cross-border loans, and courts that do not necessarily share your legal assumptions, you either quickly professionalize that process or you just stop lending out your art entirely. Restitution, in reality, is 80% archival reconstruction and 20% diplomacy. It is slow, it is very technical, it is a bit boring, and it is very legally convoluted. And that is dealing with events that happened barely a century ago. Which is why watching a video game, and more importantly, watching journals at allegedly elite publications like the New York Times flatten all of that into museum bad, heist good, is not just simplistic, it is unserious and frankly embarrassing. Alright, enough about Holocaust restitution. Now that we understand the fundamentals, let's look at colonial restitution, which is more of an offspring of Holocaust restitution. Let's clear something up before anyone starts hyperventilating. When I'm saying that certain ethnic groups in Africa, say the Egyptians, have significantly changed their cultural valuations over centuries, I do not mean they don't care about their culture. I mean that over long historical periods, how people relate to their past changes. In Egypt's case, the connection to pharaonic heritage versus later Arab Islamic heritage has shifted over time, and that in turn affected how certain artifacts were valued at specific moments in history. That is the most convoluted way of saying people sometimes value different parts of their heritage differently. That is, by the way, the case in many African cultures. That's just a historical observation. Modern heritage consciousness, the idea that every artifact is sacred, untouchable national identity, is largely a late 19th century, maybe even late 20th century development in many parts of Africa. Before that, objects really moved. They were traded, they were reused for other purposes, they were sold, or they were just discarded, sometimes under coercion, quite often completely voluntarily. In the case of Egypt, for example, large quantities of papyri were literally treated as waste paper in the 19th century, before European archaeologists realized what was being lost. It is well documented that papyri were traded for extremely low prices because they were viewed as almost worthless by the locals. It reflects different valuation frameworks at the time, but it is the main reason why the world's largest papyri collections today are in Britain and Austria. In many parts of Africa, national identity is not static across centuries. The modern Egyptian state, the 19th century Ottoman-administered province, and pharaonic Egypt are separated by thousands of years of political and cultural transformation. This is not to invalidate the modern Egyptian state's efforts to tie itself to its ancient roots, it is simply an example of how people and culture in the same geographic location can drastically change over time, and how that in turn affects how certain artifacts were valued at specific historical moments. And this matters legally, because if an object was sold in a context where it was treated as a commercial good under the law of the time, then there is no grounds for restitution. Modern restitution frameworks usually require proof of coercion, not some retroactive moral reinterpretation by a bunch of leftists. If papyrus was basically valued as packaging paper at the time and sold under such circumstances under no coercion, there are no legal grounds for its return. Even if it was treated as an artifact at the time of sale, if it was bought free of duress, that is sufficient for the transaction to hold up under most legal standards. The same applies across large parts of Africa. Pre-colonial societies were not museum cultures in the modern European sense. Many objects that today sit behind glass were ritual, functional, or just political objects embedded in living social systems. When those systems changed through internal transformation, trade, outside pressure, missionary networks, modernization, these objects entered the markets, sometimes violently, sometimes commercially, sometimes they were simply discarded. History is messy. What is intellectually unserious is pretending that the movement of cultural goods to Europe was a smash-and-grab operation driven by insatiable white greed. And that brings us to the myth that many of these artifacts are some massive economic asset that Western museums cling to out of material calculation, something Relooted heavily leans into through its entire setup and narrative. If this were really about massive material gain, African collections would be the financial backbone of European museums. They aren't. They are expensive to conserve. They are not the primary ticket drivers. In many cases, they are among the weakest performers in terms of visitor draw, and on the global art market, African antiquities, especially those not made from inherently valuable materials like bronze or ivory, command relatively modest prices compared to European old masters or impressionists. In purely material terms, returning certain objects would often be cheaper than maintaining them long term, which again undercuts this journalistic cartoon notion of evil Europeans greedily hoarding Africa's multi-trillion cultural treasures like some dragon sitting on a mountain of gold. Even within the Western cultural establishment, there is significant support for returning objects. The people working in ministries of culture and museum administrations are for the most part not exactly right-wing hardliners, quite the opposite. But even if there is a willingness to repatriate, there are still constraints. Many African countries lack the financial backbone and conservation infrastructure to properly store and preserve certain, indeed most, artifacts. In some cases, there are also questions of political stability and legal guarantees to ensure that repatriated objects remain accessible to the public and do not disappear into private hands or even worse, the black market. Thinking about it, we actually saw a recent example of this with the Benin bronzes. Valuable pieces were returned with the expectation that they would be displayed in a museum, I believe the Museum for West African History in Nigeria, only for them to become entangled in domestic political disputes almost immediately after arrival. What ended up happening is that the bronzes went to some local royal from one of the local ethnic tribal groups, and the museum, which actually received the repatriation, ended up having to use just random clay tablets as replacement. The best part of this entire story is that it's not even sure whether these bronzes are still in Nigeria, because due to them being in the ownership of what's basically a local political strongman, they may already have been sold via the black art market, and so then they have already left the country again. So what happened is that a bunch of Western leftists working at these museums have decided to return extremely valuable and rare pieces of cultural heritage, and the second they touched down in the country, they ended up in the hands of some local oligarch with the potential that they were already sold via the black market. Sometimes the jokes just write themselves. Once you understand all of that, once you even just begin to comprehend how complex restitution actually is, watching a video game review or even a New York Times article frame this as a morally uncomplicated heist fantasy stops being funny. It is just embarrassing. Hearing journalists talk about incandescent rage at how evil Europe is for keeping African art in its museums, when we have just recently seen a prime example of rare African cultural heritage touching down in Africa and virtually immediately ending up in the hands of what is basically a local strongman oligarch and then disappearing from the face of the earth, is honestly absurd. And that is what makes observing this entire media circus around this game almost so sad it isn't funny anymore. These were once respectable institutions staffed by serious people. Now we are treated to articles centered around overwhelming rage over what is at the end of the day a shallow, mechanically weak platformer wrapped in pathetic political aesthetics. Ultimately, Restitution is not remotely black and white. It is legally complex, it is historically layered, and even if you ignore these aspects, it remains a fact that successful restitution requires functioning institutions, conservation infrastructure, legal guarantees, and long-term stability. And yes, many African countries currently struggle with exactly those conditions. To be very blunt, most of Africa isn't ready for restitution yet. That's why it's so rare. Before anyone reaches for the racism card, think back to the Benin bronze incident I showed you a few minutes ago. This is not a value judgment about people, it is an institutional reality, which is precisely why watching journalists who clearly have not even the faintest understanding of how any of this works describe a shallow platformer as a righteous act of historical correction is not just misguided, it is deeply embarrassing. Celebrating a video game that reduces one of the most complex cultural policy debates of the past century to museum bad, heist good is little more than venting grievances under the cover of moral rhetoric, while being funded, published, and amplified by the very Western institutions supposedly being condemned. This game received millions in investor funding. Relooted did not fail because it was too brave. It failed because it was simplistic. It failed because it assumed that symbolic alignment would compensate for mechanical weakness. It failed because slogans do not substitute for substance. And in the attention economy, substance is the only thing that survives longer than a news cycle. Now, if you want to go deeper into Relooted's actual gameplay and see why that bet on ideological framing completely collapsed, the previous video breaks that down in detail. And if you'd rather let the algorithm curate your evening, the other video on screen is what YouTube believes you'll enjoy next. Either way, stay curious, stay skeptical, and as always, stay toasty. Cheers!